Have you ever found yourself going through the motions of faith, saying the right words, making the right gestures, but feeling nothing but emptiness inside? You wake up each morning and reach for your phone before reaching for your Bible. You attend church services, but your mind wanders to your to-do list. Your prayers feel mechanical, like reciting a grocery list to a distant stranger, rather than conversing with the Creator who knows your name. And at night, as you lay your head on your pillow, there's a gnawing sense that something essential is missing, that despite all your religious activity, you're spiritually malnourished. I want you to know that this experience is not a sign of failure, but perhaps an invitation to something deeper. What if I told you that one of the greatest spiritual masters in Christian history, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, discovered that authentic faith isn't built on religious performance, but on transformative encounter? That the very tools of devotion you might have dismissed as outdated or routine could become gateways to profound spiritual awakening when approached with the right heart. The rosary beads that gather dust on your nightstand might hold the key to a renewed relationship with God that changes everything. The story of Saint Ignatius offers us a powerful window into how traditional devotional practices can catalyze extraordinary spiritual transformation. Before he became the founder of the Jesuits and one of the most influential spiritual teachers in Christian history, Ignatius was a Spanish nobleman with worldly ambitions. His conversion didn't happen in a grand religious service or through theological study. It began when he was confined to bed after a cannonball shattered his leg in battle. During his long recovery, with nothing but religious texts to read, Ignatius noticed something remarkable happening within him. When he daydreamed about returning to his former life of military glory and romantic conquests, he initially felt excitement, but was left feeling empty and restless. Yet when he contemplated the lives of saints and imagined himself following Christ, a different sensation emerged, a sense of deep, lasting peace and meaning. This simple observation became the foundation of what Ignatius would later call the discernment of spirits, the ability to recognize the subtle movements within our hearts that lead either toward or away from God. Many of us have never learned to pay attention to these interior movements. We evaluate our faith by external metrics: attendance, knowledge, moral behavior, while remaining strangers to the inner landscape of our souls. This is precisely why devotional practices like prayer with the rosary, when approached with intentionality rather than mere routine, can become revolutionary. They create sacred space where we learn to notice the gentle stirrings of God's presence in our hearts. What made Ignatius's approach to spiritual practices so transformative was his understanding that they aren't meant to be religious achievements or methods to earn divine favor. Rather, they are relational encounters designed to open us to receiving what God already longs to give. Consider how different this is from how many approach their faith today. We live in a culture of achievement, where even our spirituality can become another self-improvement project or item on our checklist. We might pride ourselves on never missing a Sunday service, completing a Bible reading plan, or maintaining a prayer routine, yet still find ourselves spiritually parched. Ignatius would suggest that the problem isn't with the practices themselves, but with our fundamental orientation. Are we approaching them as performances to perfect, or as invitations to presence? Are we trying to control our spiritual progress, or surrendering to the mysterious work of grace? This distinction might seem subtle, but it makes all the difference between religious burnout and genuine transformation. When someone takes up the rosary for 7 consecutive nights, not as a magical formula or religious duty, but as a humble opening of themselves to divine encounter, the potential for life-changing grace multiplies exponentially. Ignatius discovered that God is constantly communicating with us, but we need to cultivate the inner stillness and attentiveness to notice. The spiritual exercises that Ignatius developed weren't meant to be merely read or studied, they were designed to be experienced. At their heart is the conviction that God deals directly with the creature. While spiritual guides and companions are valuable, Ignatius believed that the most important relationship is the one between each person and their Creator. This revolutionary idea that ordinary people, not just priests or religious experts, could develop an intimate, discerning relationship with God sent shockwaves through 16th century Catholicism. It represents a profound democratization of the spiritual life. The same principle applies to devotional practices like the rosary. While many see it as a formula of repeated prayers, the Ignatian approach would invite us to enter into it as a contemplative exercise, where each mystery becomes a scene we enter imaginatively, allowing ourselves to be present with Jesus and Mary in the unfolding of salvation history. This engagement of the imagination in prayer was one of Ignatius's most significant contributions to Western spirituality. He understood that we are not disembodied minds, but incarnate beings, and that our senses and imagination can become pathways to encountering divine reality. I want to pause for a moment here and ask you something important. Have you ever felt that despite your sincere religious efforts, God still feels distant? Like there's an invisible wall between your devotional practices and a living encounter with the divine? If you're nodding right now, I want you to know that you're not alone. Even Saint Ignatius experienced periods of spiritual dryness and desolation. If this resonates with your experience, I invite you to share in the comments with the words "I seek deeper encounter." Your honest sharing might be exactly what another person needs to read today, to know they're not alone in their spiritual hunger. Sometimes acknowledging where we truly are is the first step toward where God is inviting us to go. The community that forms through shared spiritual seeking can become a source of encouragement for all of us on this journey. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Ignatian spirituality is his teaching on consolation and desolation. These terms refer to interior movements toward or away from God, but they're often confused with pleasant or unpleasant feelings. Spiritual consolation might involve joy and peace, but it's primarily characterized by an increase in faith, hope, and love, drawing us toward God. Desolation, on the other hand, leads away from God into darkness, confusion, and self-absorption. What's counterintuitive about this teaching is that difficult emotions or circumstances don't necessarily indicate spiritual desolation. Someone might be experiencing profound grief or physical suffering, while simultaneously growing in their capacity to love God, and others a form of consolation within pain. Conversely, a person might have every external blessing and comfort while being spiritually desolate, increasingly centered on themselves rather than God. This framework offers a radically different way to evaluate our spiritual practices. The question isn't simply, do I feel good when I pray the rosary? But rather, does this practice, over time, increase my faith, hope, and love? Does it draw me out of self-preoccupation toward greater love of God and service to others? This is the true measure of spiritual growth. Ignatius's own experience with the rosary reveals something profound about devotional practices. When he was recovering from his war injuries at Loyola, he would spend hours contemplating the lives of Christ and the saints. As a knight, he was familiar with chivalric tales of heroism. But now he found himself captivated by a different kind of courage, the spiritual heroism of following Christ. During this time, he had a vision of Mary with the child Jesus that confirmed his new path. This encounter didn't happen in a vacuum, it came after hours of contemplative prayer, similar to the meditative quality of praying the rosary. For Ignatius, such devotional practices weren't about accumulating spiritual merit or mechanically fulfilling religious obligations. They were about creating conditions for divine encounter, clearing away the noise and distractions that prevent us from noticing God's constant presence. This is why sleeping with a rosary for 7 nights, when approached with the right intention, could indeed become transformative, not because the physical beads have magical properties, but because the practice represents a committed decision to reorient one's attention toward God. It's a concrete way of saying to God, I want to be more aware of your presence, even in my sleep and dreams. A pivotal experience in Ignatius's spiritual development occurred at the river Cardona near Manresa, Spain. After months of intense prayer, fasting, and spiritual struggle, Ignatius sat by the riverbank and received what he later described as a profound illumination. Not a vision of new content, but a new way of seeing everything. He wrote that he received such a great clarity in his understanding that in the entire course of his life, he did not gain as much knowledge as on that single occasion. What's remarkable about this experience is that it followed a period of tremendous spiritual desolation, where Ignatius had been tormented by scruples, religious anxieties, and doubts, and had even contemplated suicide. This pattern of breakthrough following struggle reveals something essential about the spiritual journey. Transformation often follows tribulation. The darkest moments can precede the greatest light. This offers hope for anyone experiencing spiritual dryness or feeling that their devotional practices have become empty routines. Perseverance through these desert periods often leads to unexpected grace. When someone commits to a practice like praying with the rosary for 7 consecutive nights, especially during a time of spiritual struggle, they're participating in this pattern of faithful perseverance that creates space for divine breakthrough. What makes the Ignatian approach to devotional practices so relevant today is its psychological realism. Ignatius understood that we don't change primarily through willpower or intellectual understanding, but through transformative experiences that engage our whole being. Consider his method of contemplation, where he invites us to enter imaginatively into gospel scenes using all our senses. When praying about the Nativity, for instance, we might imagine the sights, sounds, smells, and textures of the stable in Bethlehem, placing ourselves among the witnesses to Christ's birth. This approach recognizes that we are embodied creatures, not disembodied intellects. Our transformation happens not just through new ideas, but through new experiences that reshape our desires and imagination. This is why devotional practices like the rosary can become powerful vehicles for change when they're approached not as mere recitation, but as contemplative engagement with the mysteries of faith. The physical beads themselves serve as tactile anchors for our wandering attention, helping us remain present to God in a world full of distractions. For someone sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, the practice might become a way of surrendering even their unconscious mind to God's transforming work, allowing divine grace to reach the deepest parts of themselves. Ignatius's understanding of spiritual growth was profoundly integrative, refusing to separate prayer from action, contemplation from engagement with the world. His famous phrase, "contemplatives in action," captures this unified vision. Unlike some spiritual traditions that see retreat from the world as the highest path, Ignatius believed that authentic spirituality should empower us to find God in all things, even in the messiness of everyday life. This perspective transforms how we approach devotional practices. The purpose of sleeping with a rosary for 7 nights wouldn't be to escape from the world into a private religious experience, but to develop greater capacity to recognize and respond to God's presence in every dimension of life. The goal is not just consoling spiritual feelings, but an expanded ability to love and serve others. Ignatius would measure the success of such a practice not by how it makes us feel, but by how it increases our freedom to love. Are we becoming less self-centered and more generous? Less controlled by unhealthy attachments and more available to God's purposes? These are the true fruits of authentic spiritual transformation. One of the most practical gifts of Ignatian spirituality is the examine a simple method of prayerful reflection on the events of the day. In its basic form, it involves becoming aware of God's presence, reviewing the day with gratitude, paying attention to emotions that arose, choosing one feature of the day to pray about, and looking forward to tomorrow. What makes this practice so powerful is that it trains us to notice God's action in the ordinary moments we might otherwise overlook. It develops what we might call spiritual sensitivity, the ability to perceive divine presence and invitation in daily experience. This sensitivity is precisely what allows devotional practices like praying with the rosary to become transformative rather than routine. When we cultivate awareness of God's movement in our lives, even familiar prayers take on new depth and meaning. They become less about saying the right words and more about entering into relationship. For someone sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, incorporating the exam could amplify the transformation by helping them notice how God is working through the practice, what resistances or openings are emerging, and how their daily life is being affected. The examen creates a feedback loop of growing awareness that can turn even simple devotional acts into catalysts for profound change. The concept of indifference in Ignatian spirituality is frequently misunderstood. It doesn't mean not caring or emotional detachment. Rather, it refers to a spiritual freedom that allows us to embrace whatever will lead to greater love of God and service to others. Ignatius describes it as holding ourselves in balance like the pointer of a scale, not inclined more to one option than another until we discern God's will. This freedom is essential for authentic spiritual transformation, because without it, our devotional practices can become subtle forms of manipulation, attempting to get God to fulfill our predetermined wishes, rather than opening ourselves to divine purposes that might transcend our limited understanding. Consider how this applies to someone sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights. The transformative approach would involve holding the outcome in open hands, not demanding specific results or experiences, but remaining receptive to however God chooses to work. This doesn't mean passivity, but active receptivity, a willingness to cooperate with grace while surrendering control of the process and results. Paradoxically, this surrender often creates the conditions for the most profound transformation, as it removes the obstacles of our own agenda and allows God to work in unexpected ways. The Ignatian principle of finding God in all things offers a radically inclusive vision of spiritual life that breaks down artificial barriers between sacred and secular. Rather than confining God to officially religious spaces and activities, it invites us to discover divine presence in every dimension of human experience in nature, relationships, work, art, even suffering. This perspective transforms how we approach devotional practices like the rosary. Instead of seeing them as obligations that exist in a separate compartment from real life, we recognize them as focal points that heighten our awareness of a presence that permeates everything. They become less like isolated religious activities and more like concentrated moments of the same relationship with God that continues throughout our day. For someone sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, this principle suggests that the practice isn't meant to be a spiritual escape, but a training in attentiveness that gradually extends to all of life. The goal isn't just to have powerful experiences during prayer time, but to develop what Jean-Pierre de Caussade later called the sacrament of the present moment, the ability to recognize and respond to God's presence in every circumstance. This integration of prayer and daily life was central to Ignatius's vision and remains one of his most important contributions to Christian spirituality. When Ignatius talks about spiritual consolation, he's careful to distinguish between what he calls true and false consolation. True consolation originates from God and leads to greater faith, hope, and love. False consolation might produce pleasant feelings or spiritual excitement, but it ultimately leads away from God, often by inflating spiritual pride or creating unhealthy attachments to spiritual experiences themselves. This distinction is crucial for evaluating devotional practices like sleeping with the rosary. The authentic transformation such practices can facilitate isn't about dramatic spiritual phenomena or emotional highs, but about a gradual conforming of our character to Christ's loving, self-giving pattern. True consolation manifests in concrete ways: increased patience with difficult people, greater compassion for those who suffer, more courage in standing for truth, deeper commitment to justice. Without these fruits, even the most intense spiritual experiences remain suspect. Ignatius would encourage us to approach devotional practices not primarily seeking experiences, but seeking the giver of all good gifts, whose presence transforms us from the inside out, often in ways too subtle to notice immediately, but profound in their cumulative effect. The person who sleeps with the rosary for 7 nights with this understanding will be protected from both cynical dismissal of spiritual experience and uncritical pursuit of religious feelings, finding instead the middle path of authentic encounter that leads to lasting change. The spiritual exercises culminate in what Ignatius calls the contemplation to attain love, a prayer that encapsulates his vision of transformed relationship with God. In it, he invites us to consider how God dwells in all created things, labors on our behalf in all of creation, and how all good gifts descend from above. It concludes with the famous Suscipe prayer: "Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will, all that I have and possess. You have given it all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. All is yours. Dispose of it according to your will. Give me only your love and your grace, for that is enough for me." This prayer represents the ultimate goal of Ignatian spirituality: complete surrender to God, motivated by grateful love, not fear or obligation. It's a radical act of freedom, where we recognize that everything we have is gift, and the appropriate response is to offer it back to the giver. For someone sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, this perspective transforms the practice from a mechanical religious routine into a concrete expression of this surrendered love. Each bead becomes an opportunity to say yes to God's presence and purposes, to release our grip on controlling our lives, and to receive the only gifts that ultimately matter: divine love and grace. This is the trajectory of all authentic spiritual transformation, moving from self-centered religion focused on what we can get from God, to self-giving love focused on what we can offer in response to what we've already abundantly received. One of the most challenging aspects of Ignatian spirituality is his teaching on agere contra, going against our disordered tendencies and attachments. Ignatius recognized that spiritual growth isn't just about adding positive practices. It often requires actively countering the habits and attachments that hold us back. This principle helps explain why structured devotional practices like praying with the rosary can be so transformative. They provide a concrete way to resist the pull of distractions and self-centered concerns, creating space for God to work. The person who commits to sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights is engaging in a kind of gentle agere contra, countering the tendency to end the day consumed by worries or entertainment with a deliberate act of spiritual focus. What makes the Ignatian approach distinctive, however, is that this countering isn't primarily about willpower or self-discipline. It's about love. We choose to go against our disordered tendencies not because they're forbidden, but because we've tasted something better, a relationship with God that offers deeper fulfillment than whatever we're attached to. This positive motivation makes all the difference between life-giving spiritual practice and joyless religious duty. When our devotional acts flow from and toward love, they become not burdens, but privileges, opportunities to respond to the one who has first loved us. The application of the senses in Ignatian prayer engages our whole being in the encounter with God. Rather than treating prayer as a purely mental activity, Ignatius invites us to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch in our imagination as we contemplate sacred scenes. This multisensory approach recognizes that we are embodied beings, and that God meets us not by bypassing our humanity, but by engaging it fully. Consider how this transforms a practice like praying with the rosary. The beads themselves provide tactile engagement, while the mysteries invite us to imaginatively enter salvation history with all our senses. We don't just think about the Annunciation, we place ourselves in the scene, hearing the angel's greeting, seeing Mary's face, feeling the mixture of fear and wonder such a divine encounter would evoke. For the person sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, this sensory dimension adds depth to the practice. The physical presence of the beads against their skin becomes a constant reminder of God's presence, while the mysteries they've contemplated may continue working in their dreams and unconscious mind. This holistic engagement creates conditions for transformation that go beyond what merely intellectual or willful approaches to spirituality can achieve. It acknowledges that real change happens not just through new information, but through new experiences that reshape our deepest desires and imagination. Ignatius's teaching on the 2 standards provides a powerful framework for understanding the spiritual battlefield where transformation occurs. He presents 2 opposing banners: the standard of Christ, characterized by humility, poverty of spirit, and self-giving love, and the standard of the enemy, characterized by riches, honor, and pride. This meditation helps us recognize the subtle ways we're drawn towards self-aggrandizement rather than Christ-like service. What makes this teaching so challenging is that the enemy's strategy isn't primarily to make us obviously wicked, but to lead us gradually from legitimate goods, like material comfort, to excessive attachment to them, and finally to the pride that cuts us off from God and others. Applied to devotional practices, this insight helps us understand why sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights might prove transformative for some people, yet remain merely superstitious for others. The difference lies in the fundamental orientation. Are we approaching the practice with humility and openness to God's leading, or with spiritual pride and expectation of control? Are we using it as a way to deepen our capacity to love and serve, or as a religious achievement to boast about? The rosary itself is just a tool. Its transformative potential depends entirely on the spirit with which it's used. The humble heart that seeks God rather than spiritual experiences or control is the fertile ground where authentic transformation takes root and flourishes. Ignatius's personal testimony about the impact of devotional practices offers encouraging perspective for anyone struggling with spiritual dryness. In his autobiography, dictated near the end of his life, he recalls, "At that time God was dealing with him in the same way a schoolteacher deals with a child while instructing him. This is often the pattern in authentic spiritual formation periods of consolation, where God seems especially close and communicative, alternate with periods of apparent absence, where we're invited to exercise mature faith, rather than depending on consoling feelings." During his time at Manresa, Ignatius experienced both extremes: profound spiritual illumination, followed by devastating desolation, only to be followed by even deeper revelation. This oscillation isn't a sign of failure, but part of the normal rhythm of spiritual growth. For someone sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, this perspective offers important wisdom. The practice might immediately bring a sense of God's presence and peace, or it might initially feel dry and mechanical. Either experience can be part of the journey toward transformation. What matters is not the immediate feeling, but the faithful commitment to creating space for God to work. trusting that seemingly fallow periods may be preparing the soil for unexpected growth. Spiritual maturity means continuing to pray, love, and serve even when we don't feel God's presence, knowing that the absence of feeling doesn't equal the absence of God. The Ignatian approach to spiritual reading, especially of Scripture, offers valuable guidance for deepening devotional practices. Rather than rushing to cover as much text as possible, Ignatius encourages slow, contemplative engagement, where we linger over passages that stir our hearts. As he writes in the Spiritual Exercises, it is not much knowledge that fills and satisfies the soul, but the intimate feeling and relishing of things. This principle applies beautifully to praying with the rosary. Instead of racing through the prayers to finish all the decades, we might spend extended time with a single mystery, allowing it to penetrate our hearts and imagination. For someone sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, this approach suggests that depth matters more than breadth. Perhaps they might focus on just one mystery each night, entering fully into it rather than trying to cover all 20 mysteries superficially. This savoring approach recognizes that transformation happens not primarily through accumulating religious knowledge or experiences, but through allowing specific truths to sink from our minds into our hearts until they begin to reshape our desires and imagination. Just as a small amount of nutrient-rich food provides more nourishment than large quantities of empty calories, so concentrated engagement with a single spiritual truth often proves more transformative than skimming over many. One of the most hopeful aspects of Ignatius's spirituality is his teaching that it's never too late for profound transformation. His own conversion began at age 30, relatively late for his era after a worldly life focused on military glory and romantic conquests. The cannonball that shattered his leg at Pamplona marked not the end of his story, but its true beginning. This offers encouragement for anyone who feels they've wasted years on spiritual detours or dead ends. The God whom Ignatius encountered is infinitely creative in finding ways to reach us, using even our wounds and failures as gateways to grace. For someone at a crossroads in their faith journey, sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights might become their own version of Ignatius's convalescence at Loyola, a time of enforced stillness where God can speak into the noise of their lives. The practice creates a deliberate pause, a space to reconsider direction and priorities. And just as Ignatius emerged from his recovery with an entirely new vision for his life, so such intentional devotional practices might become the cocoon from which a transformed faith emerges. What matters is not our past spiritual track record, but our present openness to divine initiative. God specializes in new beginnings, in writing straight with the crooked lines of our lives. No matter how tangled our spiritual journey has been, the possibility of authentic transformation remains as near as our willingness to create space for encounter. If there's one misunderstanding that frequently blocks spiritual transformation, it's the belief that we must perfect ourselves before we can draw close to God. Ignatius offers a radically different perspective. His spirituality begins with the recognition that we are already loved sinners, the emphasis falling equally on both words. We don't earn God's love through our devotional practices. Rather, these practices help us receive and respond to a love that already surrounds us. This distinction transforms how we approach something like sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights. Instead of seeing it as a way to make ourselves worthy of divine attention, we recognize it as a concrete response to an invitation already extended. The proper motivation isn't fear, obligation, or spiritual ambition, but grateful love. As Ignatius puts it in the principle and foundation of the Spiritual Exercises, we are created to praise, reverence, and serve God, and through this to save our souls. The focus remains on relationship, not religious achievement. This perspective protects us from both presumption, thinking we don't need spiritual practices, and despair, thinking we're too broken for them to help. The truth is that God works powerfully through imperfect people who simply make themselves available through humble, consistent practices. Our weakness isn't an obstacle, but the very arena where grace operates most powerfully. The Ignatian principle of repetition offers wisdom for deepening devotional practices. In the Spiritual Exercises, Ignatius frequently instructs retreatants to return to prayers or meditations where they experienced either significant consolation or desolation. This isn't mere mechanical repetition, but a revisiting with greater awareness, allowing the Spirit to reveal new layers of meaning or areas needing further healing. Applied to a practice like sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, This principle suggests that spiritual depth comes not from constantly seeking new experiences, but from returning to fundamental truths with increasing receptivity. Each night becomes not a repetition but a deepening, as familiar prayers and mysteries reveal new dimensions. This counters our culture's addiction to novelty and its suspicion of routine. From an Ignatian perspective, consistency in spiritual practice isn't boring but essential for transformation. Just as a musician doesn't practice scales once but thousands of times to develop mastery, so we return repeatedly to foundational spiritual practices not out of superstition, but because deep change requires patience and persistence. The transformative power often lies precisely in the repetition, as it gradually reshapes our most basic perceptions and desires. What might initially feel like routine eventually becomes relationship, as the familiar prayers cease being mere words and become the contours of a conversation with the divine other who knows and loves us completely. I believe that what we need today isn't necessarily new spiritual techniques or practices, but a recovery of the transformative potential in the traditions we've inherited. Saint Ignatius shows us how seemingly simple devotions like praying with the rosary can become pathways to profound encounter when approached with intention, imagination, and openness to the Spirit. The critical difference lies not in the external practice itself, but in the internal disposition we bring to it. Are we merely going through religious motions, or are we genuinely opening ourselves to divine presence? Are we treating devotional practices as spiritual achievements to perfect, or as relational opportunities to receive? The person who sleeps with the rosary for 7 nights with humble receptivity may indeed experience the kind of transformation that changes everything, not because the practice is magical, but because it creates sustained space for the God who is always seeking us to find welcome in our distracted hearts. If you found something in this message that resonates with your spiritual hunger, I invite you to subscribe to this channel where we regularly explore the wisdom of saints like Ignatius, who can guide us toward a faith that's not just intellectually believed, but experientially lived. Each week we examine different dimensions of spiritual practice that can awaken us to the presence of God already at work in our lives. You're not alone in your desire for a faith that transforms rather than merely informs. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of how ancient devotional practices can catalyze new life in our modern spiritual journey. What makes Ignatius such a compelling spiritual guide for our times is his integration of mystical experience with practical wisdom. Unlike some spiritual teachers who offer either otherworldly mysticism or pragmatic moralism, Ignatius shows how authentic encounter with God naturally flows into concrete action in the world. His own life demonstrates this pattern. After his conversion and the profound spiritual experiences at Manresa, he didn't withdraw to a monastery, but founded a religious order dedicated to active service in education, mission, and social engagement. This integration challenges the false dichotomy between contemplation and action that plagues much contemporary spirituality. It suggests that sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, if approached in an Ignatian spirit, shouldn't lead to spiritual escapism, but to greater capacity for loving service. The measure of the practice's transformative power isn't primarily how it makes us feel, but how it increases our freedom to love God and others. This connection between devotion and service distinguishes authentic spiritual transformation from mere religious experience seeking. The divine encounter that changes everything manifests not just in consoling feelings or insights, but an expanded capacity to be Christ's hands and feet in a wounded world. As Ignatius famously instructed his followers, love ought to manifest itself more by deeds than by words. Our devotional practices find their fulfillment not in the prayer corner, but in how they empower us to live more generously and courageously in everyday life. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of the Ignatian vision is its trust in the personal relationship between each soul and God. While he valued spiritual direction and the wisdom of tradition, Ignatius insisted that the Creator deals directly with the creature, and the creature directly with the Creator. This intimate, unmediated connection forms the heart of authentic spiritual life. For someone sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights, this principle offers both responsibility and freedom. No one can program or predict exactly how God will work through such a practice in a particular life. The transformation unfolds according to God's unique purposes for that individual, addressing their specific wounds, gifts, and calling. This personalization of the spiritual journey protects us from both rigid formulas. If you do X, God must do Y, and vague spirituality. It doesn't matter what you practice as long as you're sincere. Instead, it invites us to approach devotional practices with both definite commitment and open expectation, creating space for the divine other to work in ways that transcend our planning or understanding. The God whom Ignatius encountered is infinitely respectful of our uniqueness, while persistently drawing us toward the universal human vocation to love. Our devotional practices become not generic religious routines, but personalized meeting places where this God addresses us by name, calling forth our truest and most authentic selves. As we draw our exploration to a close, I invite you to consider your own spiritual practices, not as religious obligations or magical formulas, but as invitations to transformative encounter. The story of sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights serves as a parable for any intentional practice that creates space for God to work in our distracted lives. Whether it's morning meditation, scripture reading, fasting, service to the poor, or liturgical prayer, the externals matter far less than the heart we bring to them. Saint Ignatius offers us a spirituality that's both deeply mystical and eminently practical, challenging us to move beyond religious routine into authentic relationship. His own life testifies that genuine encounter with God changes everything, not in a superficial, emotional way, but in a deep reordering of values, priorities, and capacities. The greatest fruit of such transformation is an expanded freedom to love, a liberation from the self-absorption that lies at the root of our deepest suffering. If something in this message has touched your heart, I invite you to take one small, concrete step toward creating more space for God in your daily life. It might be as simple as setting aside 5 minutes for silent presence, praying with a single gospel scene using your imagination, or performing an act of service with full attention. God is already reaching toward you. These practices simply help you notice and respond to a love that has never stopped pursuing you. If you found this exploration helpful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more content that explores the wisdom of saints like Ignatius for contemporary spiritual life. Your spiritual journey matters, and it would be a privilege to accompany you on it. Thank you for your attention and openness. May God meet you powerfully in the ordinary moments of your day, transforming them into encounters with the extraordinary love that holds all things together. Have you ever noticed how the things we keep closest to us while we sleep reflect what we most value? Some people sleep with their phones under their pillows, constantly connected to a world of notifications and distractions. Others keep treasured photos or mementos nearby, maintaining connection with cherished relationships even in sleep. The practice of sleeping with a rosary for 7 nights, like we've been discussing, represents a profound choice about what we allow to shape us at the deepest level, even our unconscious mind. It declares that we want our relationship with God to permeate every dimension of our lives, including the vulnerable state of sleep, where we process experiences and form memories. This intentionality stands in stark contrast to the passive consumption that characterizes much of modern life, where we absorb whatever content algorithms feed us without reflection on how it's forming our desires and imagination. Ignatius would challenge us to be more deliberate about what we allow to shape us, recognizing that transformation happens not just through what we consciously choose, but through what we consistently expose ourselves to. The beads of the rosary kept close through 7 nights become a tactile reminder of this choice to place our relationship with God at the center, allowing divine love rather than cultural messaging to define our identity and purpose. This is the heart of spiritual transformation, not self-improvement techniques, but a fundamental reorientation of what we love and what we allow to love us. Saint Ignatius understood something profound about spiritual transformation, that we often forget it unfolds according to God's timing, not our demands. His concept of the principle and foundation emphasizes that we are created to praise, reverence, and serve God, not to accomplish our spiritual agendas or timelines. This wisdom is essential for anyone undertaking a practice like sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights. The specified duration 7 nights suggests the biblical symbolism of completion, but Ignatius would caution us against treating it as a formula that guarantees particular results by a certain date. Authentic transformation often includes surprising delays, detours, and dormant periods where God is working beneath the surface in ways we can't perceive. The person who approaches devotional practices with this understanding of divine timing will be protected from both discouragement, when change seems slow, and presumption, expecting God to work according to our schedule. What matters is not the pace, but the direction are we moving, however gradually, toward greater capacity to love God and others. This patient perspective counters our culture's obsession with immediate results and quantifiable outcomes. The most significant spiritual transformations often begin almost imperceptibly, like seeds germinating underground long before any visible growth appears. Our task is simply to create consistent space through practices like the rosary, trusting the divine gardener to bring growth in the proper season. If these reflections on the transformative potential of devotional practices through the lens of Ignatian spirituality have touched something in your heart, I invite you to subscribe to this channel where we continue exploring pathways to authentic faith beyond religious routine. Each week we examine different dimensions of spiritual wisdom from traditions that have stood the test of time, finding fresh applications for our contemporary challenges. The journey toward a faith that transforms, rather than merely informs, is both challenging and deeply fulfilling. And it's not meant to be walked alone. By subscribing, you'll join a community of fellow seekers who are asking similar questions and discovering that ancient practices hold surprising relevance for modern spiritual hunger. Whether you're just beginning to explore faith or seeking to revitalize a lifelong spiritual journey, I would be honored to accompany you through these conversations about what matters most. Thank you for your openness and attention today. Your presence here is already a sign of the Spirit's invitation in your life, drawing you toward the love that alone can satisfy our deepest longings. May you discover, perhaps in unexpected ways, that God is already nearer to you than you are to yourself. The story of Saint Ignatius reminds us that spiritual transformation often begins in times of disruption and limitation. It was during his forced convalescence, when all his plans and ambitions were interrupted by a cannonball wound, that he discovered a new path. This offers hope for anyone experiencing unwanted limitations, illness, loss, failure, or restriction. These very constraints can become doorways to deeper spiritual life if we approach them with openness rather than resentment. The practice of sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights might be especially meaningful during such times of disruption, creating a container for grace when everything else feels uncertain. Ignatius would encourage us to look for God's presence, not despite our limitations, but within them, recognizing that divine wisdom often works through what appears at first to be obstacle or loss. His spirituality doesn't offer escape from life's difficulties, but transformation within them. As we learn to find God in all things, even the most challenging, this perspective can revolutionize how we approach not just formal devotional practices, but every circumstance of our lives. Rather than constantly seeking ideal conditions for spiritual growth, when I have more time, when things settle down, we recognize that the present moment, with all its imperfections and constraints, is precisely where God waits to meet us. This makes authentic transformation available not just to those with the luxury of retreat, but to anyone willing to open their heart in whatever circumstances they find themselves. What would Ignatius say to someone contemplating sleeping with the rosary for 7 nights as a spiritual practice? I believe he would affirm the intention, while offering wise guidance to ensure it becomes truly transformative, rather than merely superstitious. First, he would encourage examining the motivation. Are we seeking relationship with God, or trying to control outcomes? Are we approaching the practice with humble openness or with rigid expectations? Second, he would suggest preparing the heart through the exam, becoming aware of our current spiritual state and the particular graces we need. Third, he would recommend engaging the imagination fully with the mysteries of the rosary, not just reciting prayers, but entering contemplatively into the scenes from Christ's life. Fourth, he would emphasize integration, connecting this nighttime practice with daytime choices that align with the values the rosary represents. Fifth, he would counsel patience and perseverance, recognizing that significant transformation usually unfolds gradually rather than dramatically. Finally, he would recommend spiritual accompaniment, sharing this journey with a wise companion who can help discern the movements of the Spirit. With these elements in place, what might otherwise be a mechanistic religious routine could indeed become a gateway to the kind of encounter that changes everything from the inside out. This is the promise of Ignatian spirituality, not that religious practices in themselves have magical power, but that when approached with the right heart, they create space for the God who is already seeking us to find welcome in our lives.